last legislative session, they passed a bill dealing with historical monuments, places, renaming of places in Alabama that are parks or of some significance, and defined what municipalities and counties could do relating to those monuments and relating to those areas. The city of Birmingham made a decision relating to Lynn Park. The mayor decided to build a boundary around a monument that had been there for over 100 years. You know, the statute is pretty specific about defining what is an historical monument. I don't think there's any dispute that what is in Birmingham and what has the barrier around it is an historical monument. The question is whether or not they have violated the statute by the building of those particular walls. We believe they have. We notified the city of Birmingham that we believe that they were in violation of the statute. They've taken a position that they in fact have not altered or otherwise disturbed that monument, and so they left them there, and it gave us no other alternative but to be able to file suit. The statute itself speaks to the Attorney General's office being the enforcement authority relating to that statute. My job as Attorney General is not to take a political side, is not to take a policy position relating to statutes. My job is to make sure that the law is enforced, and that's exactly what we did. One of the issues for us in the Birmingham matter was to make sure that we filed quickly. I felt like that was as much of a public safety decision as it was a legal decision about the lawsuit, because, you know, to the extent that we got it into the courts, one of the things that we've been able to do is to tell all parties who have strong feelings one way or the other, this is going to be decided by a judge and eventually an appellate court about whether or not what the city did was right or wrong. And so part of my communication last Wednesday when we decided to file this was with law enforcement in Birmingham to say, number one, are we seeing any potential problems? And number two, this is coming and this is how we're going to choose to handle it. So felt like that was the right thing to do. I think we have seen the fact that there has not been any outburst in Birmingham by whatever side who takes whatever position. I think validates the decision for us to be able to move quickly. Beyond that, you know, law enforcement is well trained. And so when we see, especially in some of our larger cities, there are specific groups and teams that are trained to deal with big crowds. You know, we see it for large outdoor events, for example. So it's not like we're not used to dealing with crowds. But the other thing is to make sure that they have the appropriate training that they need to know how to address these. You know, violent protest has no place. I don't care what group you're involved with. There is no role for that under the Constitution, number one, that gives folks the right to peacefully gather. But beyond that, I don't think it creates a positive narrative for communities to be able to discuss what are compelling issues. I understand the discussion both ways relating to the Confederate monuments, for example. But violent protests don't do anything to allow communities to truly address that discussion going forward. And so you would hope that those who would gather would do so consistent with not only their constitutional right to gather, but also do it peacefully. But to the extent that they choose to engage in violent behavior, then it's our obligation to be able to hold them accountable, and that's one way we make folks safe. Well, as a practical matter, number one, I support law enforcement completely. You know, and every day they go to work not knowing whether they're going to return home. And as communities and as a state, we need to support the commitment and the sacrifice they make to protect and serve. You know, if you look out one of the windows in my office, it looks directly over the law enforcement memorial that sits on the Capitol lawn. You know, I lost a police chief while I was district attorney in Marshall County. 2 other officers were shot in the line of duty, and so I have a responsibility to be their advocate and to be their voice, not only in the issue of laws that affect the state of Alabama, but also, you know, their advocate relating to how communities respond to them. You know, every once in a while, a thank you probably helps. Every once in a while, communities coming together to tell them we appreciate them would help. Having said that, just because I support law enforcement doesn't mean that they somehow or another get a free pass relating to events that take place that are otherwise illegal. You know, one of the most significant cases I've tried in my career as a prosecutor was a law enforcement officer who committed ethics violations. He violated the law. Regardless of my support of law enforcement, he's no different than anybody else that chooses to break the law in this state. And again, it's similar to the situation in Birmingham. I'm not there to pick sides. I'm not there necessarily to choose what my policy or personal beliefs may be, but my job is to enforce the law fairly and equally across all barriers, across all occupations, across all races. And so my support of law enforcement doesn't take away the fact that we need to make sure that law enforcement complies with the law. In that situation, he was convicted. I think it sent a message to our local law enforcement, again, to be reminded of the fact that we set the standard in our communities, both professionally and personally, but that we're not immune from prosecution if we do wrong. And so as much as I appreciate and respect what law enforcement does, I also have a role occasionally to make sure that they are held accountable also. Well, first of all, I appreciate Governor Ivey's confidence in me to do this. I went to her, told her what a significant situation this was in Alabama, and it's really from multiple fronts. Number one, as a state, when we are number one in per capita prescriptions for opioids, almost 1.5 scripts per person in the state, that's troublesome. We're not, I think, that much sicker than other people. I don't think we have that many more injuries. It obviously reflects that there is a prescribing question that we need to be able to address. The other thing that we're seeing, for example, from a law enforcement side is an officer safety perspective, and that because you can't talk about opioids without talking about heroin and also talking about fentanyl. Fentanyl is incredibly dangerous to the touch. You may have seen the story where the young child died in Florida just from being exposed to fentanyl. We have stories for law enforcement actually reaching into bags or compartments, touching fentanyl and beginning to potentially overdose themselves. And so it's a law enforcement safety question. And then beyond it, we hear the stories of the overdoses. We lose 147 people per day in this country to overdose. Opioids are a significant problem in that area. And so we've got to bring together a law enforcement perspective, a public health perspective, and a mental health perspective relating to substance abuse treatment and recovery to be able to address this issue in Alabama. Now, Governor Ivey has given us a December 31st deadline. She's ready for there to be a strategic plan. It's our obligation through this task force. We'll begin meeting on September 5th to put up a proposal for her about where we are going forward. But also one of the things that I'll recommend to her is this group needs to continue to work. Although we have a narrow time frame to be able to get her a plan, I think this is a continuing issue that we need to not only sort of develop proposals going forward, but also engage in really some data analysis to make sure that if we have proposals that are out there, if there are things that we're doing, do we see it having a difference going forward in this state? And you can look to the problem with crystal meth labs, for example. We had a significant issue in the state with these mom and pop labs that not necessarily creating a bunch of weight on the street, but a health issue for families and especially for kids that are exposed to that environment. It's an environmental problem as well. By a change in the law, by us showing our IDs, using technology to allow each of our vendors of ephedrine and pseudoephedrine to talk to one another, the Walmarts, the Walgreens, the CVS's, we reduced meth labs by 90% in the state in 5 years. We need to show that we can make a similar success on opioids, heroin, fentanyl, carfentanil going forward that allows us through data to demonstrate that we're making a difference. Opioids obviously are typically coming through prescriptions or potentially other clandestine sources. Heroin and fentanyl is really coming from different places. Fentanyl potentially more from China. Heroin, we're seeing that come more from the cartels across the border in Mexico and South America. And so it's not like, again, crystal meth where you were making some of that locally.
Right.
This is one that's clearly coming from outside this country in. And one of the reasons why I think heroin has created such a stir and been such a problem, partly because of the opioid issue. People have moved from opioids to heroin as their addiction gets worse. But also there's more heroin on the street and it's cheaper. And I think that's mattered as well. And some law enforcement will tell you that that's somewhat attributable to the legalization of marijuana out west. As the cartels saw that they had a decline in business on marijuana, they converted those marijuana fields to poppy fields, allowed for heroin then to become greater of an emphasis for them and become cheaper on the streets.